since the pandemic, we've also invited people from other universities to share their research with us.
Typically where the referent either isn't well known, like you don't know who it is specifically, or the gender isn't known. A classic example of that would be a quantified case where you have each or every or some, and this usage goes back to Middle English. So one known case that's transcribed here, or it's converted into modern English. Each man hurried till they drew near. So this is actually pretty interesting, especially because it's a gendered case. You know they're men, you could say he, but they say they instead. It also appears in other authors like Jane Austen. I would have everybody marry if they could do it properly. Shakespeare uses it as well. I did a little search through the Democratic Convention. Tim Walz is a great example, a great user of generic they. So everyone is free to build the kind of life they want, or when somebody takes the time to drop a playbook, they're going to use it. We also have, this was another case in the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing. So a conservative woman is arguing against abortion and says, and when I'm walking and a young mother comes up to me, as I said earlier, I say, good morning, I'm Eleanor, how can I help you? And I give them the card at the same time. Other examples are where it's a specific person, and I just made this one up because I couldn't find a good example. I went to the store and went up to the clerk and they told me where to find rice, right? The clerk is somebody you saw, and nowadays the kind of stated, like people tell you, you're not supposed to assume the gender of somebody else. You're supposed to ask them. But realistically, we assume gender all the time. Like, let's just be real, okay? We absolutely assume gender. And if I see a clerk in the store, I am probably going to make some judgments about their gender. And so, but I don't necessarily need to I don't need to refer to that with my pronoun later if I'm talking to somebody else, because really it doesn't matter what the gender of the clerk is if I'm just talking about where I'm going to buy some rice. So this is another kind of common usage of generic singular they. Things are changing more recently in that now sometimes there are individuals who are choosing to use they as their personal pronoun. And this is a sort of case where somebody says, hi, I identify as gender non-binary and I use they them pronouns. And when you say, this is a kind of the colloquial way of saying it. People say, I use they, them pronouns. What that really means is I want you to use them when you talk about me. So it's a signal of what pronouns you want other people to use when they refer to you. And so one little caveat here, I've kind of started to use this term non-binary they because I want to distinguish from what I'm calling generic they, because the pragmatic conditions for using it are very different. It evokes this idea that it is related to non-binary gender identity. But there's a huge caveat here because there are many people who identify as gender non-binary who don't use they. So it's not like there's some kind of community-wide agreement that this is the required pronoun. There are other gender-neutral pronouns like neopronouns. And then some people just choose to continue using he or she just for convenience as well, or they use other pronouns. There's a lot of variation there. It is also the case that there are some people who identify as cisgender. They might identify as female or male, but they want to use they as their personal pronoun. And so this term non-binary, they really refers to the use of they for somebody who uses it as their personal pronoun, which does not necessarily mean anything about their gender identity, although it's correlated with gender identity. So all this long caveat that I had to give you about the name is related to changes in the way that people are thinking about and talking about what gender is. And so this is something also that's super fascinating to me. So the traditional view that I kind of grew up with and didn't really think about very much is that you were just born a boy or a girl. Like you come home and you've been identified as one or the other and you grow up as that. So, and this is the idea that gender is defined by sex, it's binary and it's fixed. And by contrast, a lot of people these days, especially young people, tell me, no, of course that's wrong. That's not the way it is at all. Gender identity is fluid. And it's really just your own personal identity. It can change from day to day. Some people identify not even not strictly within one category or the other, meaning that gender is not binary. And so it can include other identities like non-binary or gender fluid or gender queer identities. Gender non-binary has been defined as having a gender identity that doesn't fit into binary categories, which still is pretty open-ended. Gender fluid is that gender identity is not defined by the male-female continuum and it can change from day to day. So, one very frequently cited statistic comes from this non-academic survey about which I can find practically zero information because it's not published in an academic journal, but it's been cited a lot. So more than half of millennials think that gender exists on a spectrum as opposed to being binary. And so this does suggest that there is a shift in how people are thinking about gender. Now, why would we be looking at pronouns with respect to this issue? And as I'm sure everybody here realizes, because you're all a part of this, American English-speaking community, is that people are talking about pronouns because pronouns are a symbol of gender. They're highly frequent words, which means that every time you use one, it imposes a gender categorization. And so around 2015, this led to a movement to showcase pronouns as a symbol of gender identity. And it's also seen as a way to demonstrate inclusivity by asking about somebody else's pronouns or about announcing your own pronouns and signaling that this is an okay thing to do. And so socially, this contrasts with the standard for, when I grew up, it was like, it would be embarrassing to toss somebody's pronouns because it was simply not done. It was, in fact, expected that you should be able to guess what somebody else's pronouns were. So this leads me to a set of research questions that have to do with the language processing system. So as Edith said before, I'm interested in the processes of both comprehension and production. And so what does this mean for our processing systems? Because we have these pretty well-developed systems that have been in use for our entire lives for understanding he and she, not just he and she pronouns, but also other pronouns, it, they in the plural, whatever. We are at this very unique point in history right now where non-binary they is not something that anybody has grown up with. There may be children being born today into families where it's used, so that we might start to see, in 18 years, my subjects at the university might have grown up with it. I pretty frequently ask my students, I teach a class called Gender and Pronouns, and so we talk about this, and I always ask them, when did you first hear about this form? In fact, let me put that out to the audience since we're a nice kind of smallish group. If you guys don't mind putting it in the chat, let me see if I can find the chat. How do I find the chat here? When did you hear about it more or less? And I mean like broadly, like middle school, high school, college. Let me see if I can find the chat. Okay, I'm seeing high school, college, grad school, 8th grade, that's the youngest, okay. High school, yeah. So see, that's kind of typically what I hear. It depends on where people grew up, whether they heard about it before they got to college. Certainly they usually hear about it in college, if not earlier. And so what that means, the reason why this is so exciting is because it means that we're now looking at how this new form is being integrated into an existing processing system. So this leads to questions. One question that's not even on here is whether we're going to be processing this using the same mechanisms that we already have in place for other types of personal pronouns in comprehension in terms of how we understand them. In production, are we going to use the same kind of production processes? How is this going to be different from the production of, say, he and she pronouns? And given that this is such a new form, what are the things that correlate with increased facility? So if you want to get better at it, what do you need to do? What are the things that's going to make it easier for you to be able to produce and understand this form? And that's an issue that is actually of very significant personal significance for many people. So, there are a lot of people who have like somebody in their family who says, hey, I now use they, them pronouns. I want you to use them for me. And in most cases, everybody I've met always says, yeah, I want to support them. I've never actually met somebody face to face who says that they're, I'm not going to support somebody else in using their pronouns. I know that from the media, this is like a big thing, and there are people out there who, refuse to accept them. But in many, many, many cases, people want to use them correctly, but they still have a little bit of difficulty. So trying to understand what the conditions are that support that is of kind of practical significance as well. So I'm going to basically talk about studies in each of these three sections: comprehension and production, and a final, if I have time, a study where we explored some individual differences, looking at three metrics. One is exposure to non-binary they, personal gender identity, and whether it falls on a kind of binary or fluid identity, and also your own concepts about what gender is. Is it binary or is it fluid? One important thing to say about my methods is that I am interested in studying language in a grounded context, because I want to look at language in a context that is the most similar to the way we use language in real life. Now, of course, we don't live our life in a cartoon world, but we kind of get as close to that real life as we can in an experiment context by using cartoons. And so we have this cartoon world of characters. Liz, who uses she, her pronouns, Alex uses they, them, Anna uses she, her, and Will and Matt use he, him pronouns. And so we introduce people to these characters, and then they either hear about them or talk about them. So to start with comprehension, this is some research that I did with Heather Mayo and Lisa Dong. I just want to point out that all the research I'm talking about today has been done in collaboration with undergraduate researchers. So this research program has actually been very fruitful for supporting the development of young scholars, because I think it's been of such kind of social significance. It's drawing people in. And so with them, we devised this study where we were interested in finding out what would facilitate the interpretation of they as an ambiguous word. So one complaint you might hear people say about the use of non-binary, they say, oh, well, it's too ambiguous. It makes it unclear what the speaker means. And so obviously this is not a psycholinguist who would be saying that, because the fact is that all of language is ambiguous, and in particular pronouns. So you want an ambiguity, just look at the words he and she. And we as humans are incredibly well positioned to deal with that ambiguity. We've got a whole processing system that is well developed to figure out what we think the speaker is most likely to mean. And so the question is, what kinds of things are going to push people toward that singular interpretation? And so we did a very simple survey questionnaire type study where people would read little sentences like, Alex was drying dishes, they broke some plates. And then they're asked a question, who broke some plates? Either Alex or Alex and Will. And they're told that if you click on the picture of the two people, you mean that they did it together. Or we could have a story like, Alex was drying dishes with Will, they broke some plates. Or Will was drying dishes with Alex and they broke some plates. And so what these exemplify here are the conditions that we had across our different experiments. So in experiment one, we compared the singular with the Alex first conditions. And in the other experiments, we compared these two linguistic conditions here. And so previous work with he and she pronouns shows that the linguistic condition is going to matter. When you have just one person, that'll be very easy to assign the pronoun to that person. Because pragmatically, there's like nobody else that would make sense as a potential referent. I mean, it's not impossible. You can have pronouns refer to somebody who's not present, but it's going to be much, much more natural if it refers to somebody in the story. We also know from he and she pronouns that people like to assign pronouns to the first of two people mentioned. And when I say first, I don't really mean first. I actually mean the grammatical subject, because if you have two people in a phrase like Alex and Will, you can't really pronominalize either one of them independently. It would have to be plural in that case. So really, I mean, it goes to the grammatical subject. People kind of prefer for it to go to the grammatical subject. Okay. So that was one set of questions we had, which was how was the linguistic condition going to drive interpretation? But we also had a question about um, how people would be influenced by hearing Alex's pronouns explicitly identified at the beginning of the experiment. And so this is a replication of the event where, socially people say, hey, my pronouns are they, them, or they, wear, like put it on their Zoom or put it on a button pin, or, it kind of explicitly tell you these are my pronouns. And, I think that at some level, it's like, well, no, duh, of course it has to matter, because if you don't know that somebody's pronouns are they, them, then you would never assign it as a singular meaning. So that's not actually exactly what we mean. What we mean is hearing it said explicitly, will that matter over and above other kind of more implicit information that that person uses they, them pronouns? Because sometimes you don't have to be told, you can kind of just figure it out from the context. And so what we did is we had these training stories that mentioned Alex's in the singular. So it'd be things like, Alex went to the store, they bought milk. Okay. And then they would be asked, who bought milk, Alex or Alex and Liz? And pragmatically, it doesn't make sense. It can't be Alex and Liz. It has to be Alex, because that's the only person in the story. And so in both the conditions, both where they had been explicitly and implicitly introduced to the pronouns, to saying, Alex uses they, them pronouns, we showed them just as a part of the experiment, it included early on some of these that we're calling training sentences, or like Alex saw a worm on the sidewalk. They tried to pick it up. That's another example there. And anybody who didn't show a singular interpretation of it 100% of the time, all 4 of those training sentences, they were excluded. They were thrown out. And you might say, oh my God, that's too harsh. Well, yeah, it's pretty extreme, except for the fact that that's super important, because what that means is that now we know for certain that everybody who's included in our final analysis is somebody who recognizes that Alex uses they, them pronouns. That's super important, because otherwise it would be, any difference that we see in the data would just, maybe it's just they didn't figure it out. Maybe they just didn't know. And that's not what we're looking for. So what we found across all the experiments we did, we actually did a total of 4 experiments. 3 of, I'm trying to remember how, 3 of them were presented at what I believe was still called a CUNY conference at that time. And 3 are in the paper, but they're slightly different subsets, but they all showed kind of the same thing. So basically what we find is that in the condition where the pronouns are introduced explicitly, people are more likely to choose Alex as the referent they by clicking on the picture of Alex. So what we're plotting here is rate of singular. So this is rate of singular. Higher means more they to Alex, and lower means more plural interpretation. And so you can see here that in experiment 1, well, here we in the 1 character condition, people were at ceiling. They always assigned it to Alex almost all the time. And again, that's because these were the people who responded to those same kinds of sentences in the training sentences by selecting Alex. So they've just shown that that's how they interpret that. So that's not too surprising. Okay, so they're at ceiling there. But where we see the differences in the 2 character condition, more singular in the explicit than the implicit conditions. And then the experiment, this is just showing experiment 2, and the other experiments basically showed the same thing. Again, we're seeing a difference between the explicit and implicit. We're also seeing the kind of expected effect of linguistic condition. So here, more singular in the 1 character than 2 character, and more singular when Alex is first versus second. And so that's exactly what we would have expected, given what else we know about he and she pronouns. And so the take-home messages here are that pronoun introduction helps people get the singular interpretation for they. And, singular they is interpreted in the same kind of way as he and she, based on the same sorts of discourse conditions. Single character and first mention support pronoun interpretation. So, okay, I'm finishing up. That's the end of the comprehension section. I'm going to move on to production. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions? And by the way, I can't really see the chat unless I kind of quit out of this and go to another place. So instead of putting it in the chat, just go ahead and put your hand up or shout it out. I guess nobody has any questions, but you know what? Feel free to jump in if you got a question at any point. You can just, put your hand up.
Well, actually, Jennifer, I do have a question.
Yeah.
What did matter if you have so right now your two character sentences are they like Alex washed the dishes with Will, they blah 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 blah. What if you have them coordinated, like Alex and Will were washing dishes,
Mhm.
they blah 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 blah, so you no longer have that prominence issue going on. Would that be interesting to look at?
Personally, I wouldn't find it that interesting because it is a context that, like, you just get 100% they, plural. And that would be
Mhm.
true, but there, for any kind of pronoun. Like if
Mhm.
I said, you know, Anna and Liz went to the movies and she had popcorn, it'd be like, what? It doesn't make any sense, right? There's no plural interpretation for she, so it's just confusing. Now, it is the case that there is this usage where sometimes people use gender kind of contrastively. So, like, you know, Barack and Michelle both talked at the Democratic Convention, and she was wearing this incredible outfit, or something like that. So you can distinguish with people, but it kind of requires that contrastive accenting, and so it's, I think, a kind of specialized case. In general, you can't tear it when you have two people introduced together, they become one referent, right? So Michelle and Barack would be like one combined referent there, and you can't just refer to one of them easily. Um, okay. But that's a good question because that also goes to show that the linguistic context, as in everything, is going to play a huge role. And so when we talk about, properly respecting somebody by using, recognizing they when used in a non-binary sense, that only becomes relevant when it's used in a context where it would make sense to use that. Like nobody would expect you to take the singular they there because it's just not really linguistically available. So, okay, moving on to production. What's going on when we produce this form? Okay. Now, anecdotally, people find it hard. And I know this because people kind of want to talk about this all the time. Like whenever I go to a party and people find out that I study this, like they always want to talk about this. And people very frequently express to me that it's something they feel kind of bad about getting like tripped up on. I know I kind of feel bad about it because given that I study it, I really should be better at using it. And yet it's a low frequency form for me too, because I learned it late in life. And so I also have a little bit of trouble with it. The very first study we did to look at this was done with written language. And again, this was done with actually not all undergraduates. So Atziri and Genevieve were undergraduates at the time that we did this work, and Jifeng was a master's student in linguistics at UNC. And we looked at published articles that talk about either a real or fictional person who uses they, them as their personal pronouns. And as a restriction, we also made sure we were only looking at articles where the writer was consistent about using the appropriate pronoun. And there were cases out there where the author would misgender the referent and kind of mix up he with they, for example. But we then took that same writer and found another, either the same paper or same, article or some other article where they were talking about a person who uses either he or she pronouns to do a comparison. And we first did a little very simple linguistic analysis to say, is this reference happening in a case where the person has been previously mentioned in the preceding sentence, which is what we called given, versus they haven't been mentioned in the preceding sentence, in which case they're called new. So a very, very simplistic, broad categorization of given versus new. And you do expect that people are going to use pronouns more when somebody was just recently mentioned than not. And that is exactly what we found for both they and he, she pronouns. So the rate here, what we're looking at is how often do you use a pronoun versus some other form of reference? Because, of course, you can very respectfully refer to somebody using their name or role, right? The artist, the writer, whoever it is you're writing about. Often these articles were about like famous people. And so the question is, when are you going to use a pronoun versus a name? And we know from decades of research on reference production, some of which I've done, that the discourse context plays a very big role. And we saw that again here, just as we expected. The real question then is whether there was a difference between the rate of producing they versus he and she. And we found that there was. So people were more likely to produce he and she than they in equivalent discourse contexts. And so we see here that, yes, there's more for given than new in both cases, but this one here is higher than this one. So the he, she is higher than that, and this one's higher than that one. So this is what writers do. And we had two analyses for why this might be. One could have been a result of the production process itself. And I'm going to get into this in a second when I talk about the spoken language study. But if we think about language as a competitive process, competitive models of production processing, if there is competition between the pronoun and the name, if the pronoun they is kind of less activated because it is a lower frequency form and it's competing with the name might win out more often. And so this would explain why you're getting more pronouns for he, she, where it's a higher frequency form and it doesn't suffer from that kind of low frequency problem as they. There's a second possibility here, which is that when you're writing, you don't know who your audience is. And so writers might be more conservative about making judgments about whether their audience is going to understand this non-binary they. And since it's an emerging form, they might not have had the confidence that their readers were going to understand it. So that also could have been a second reason that they would have suppressed the use of they. So our next question, though, is what do people do when they're speaking? Speech is a little different from writing. You have to, for social reasons, you can't just like stop and think for a long period of time. You have to show that you're on task. You have to keep speaking. This is what leads people to be disfluent sometimes, because that shows that they're sort of still involved even while they're thinking. But it's also different because it's more grounded. You have a specific audience in mind, a person who's there in the room with you who you're talking to. And so we wanted to know what would happen when people are telling stories about characters who either use they or he or she as their personal pronouns. This one was done with Ranjini Venkatesh and Zach Vig, who were both undergraduates at the time we did this. Zach is now a graduate student in our program, and Ranjini has graduated as well. And and this work has been published in Gloss of Psycholinguistics, so you can find it there. So what we did is had people tell little stories to the experimenter. And the experimenter was actually either Ranjini or Zach or Ashai, who was a third student who helped out with this. And they would get a written sentence for the first panel of the cartoon, and they would just read it off the screen. And then they would get a prompt on the second panel, and they would finish it off based on what was on the picture to help tell the story. So our stimuli had a target character who did something interesting in the second panel. So here, Alex is our target character. And Anna is there, but she's just like doing the same thing in the two different panels. So she's kind of backgrounded. She's less interesting and less likely to be mentioned. And indeed, people don't mention her as much. This is actually a technique that was developed, that I developed in collaboration with Zenzi Griffin in Arnold and Griffin 2007. So we had 4 conditions. In one condition, our target character was Alex, who was our one non-binary character. And either was with a second person present, in this case, you see it's Anna, or we edited the pictures so that we took Anna out and it was just Alex by themselves. And it said, Alex played basketball on the neighborhood court. At one point, they made a basket. And then we had equivalent conditions where the target character was one of the other characters who use either he or she pronouns. So what we found was basically people are using more pronouns. They're choosing pronouns over names. That's the question. Do they use a pronoun or a name? And they're choosing relatively more pronouns in the one-person stories, which is exactly what we've seen before for he and she. And they did that for both they and for he and she. Okay, so again, the discourse context matters, and it matters for they just like it does for he and she. So that shows that it's really just a part of the same linguistic system. Our participants here were UNC students. And there was no suppression of they. So differently from the writing study, we didn't see any suppression of they. It actually was used a little bit more than he and she. And for speculations on why that is, I'll let you read our paper. Of interest, though, is that they was a little bit more difficult. And we saw that in that there were about 9% of the trials had misgendering errors where people said he for Alex. It was always he. They never said she. And there was not a single error ever for the binary characters. We also saw that the pronunciation was more acoustically prominent for they than for he and she, based on perceptual ratings. And that is kind of, that's a more disfluent sounding pronunciation, which again indicates that they're having a little bit more difficulty. So we interpret this based on what I call the usage-based model, which is essentially a competitive model. This is not really that different from proposals that have been made out there for other kinds of word production. That the choice between related words for a particular referent are going to be in competition with each other. One thing that is new to this is that we're proposing here that there's a kind of general pronoun class that would include all potential pronouns. And then there's like a name class. We've got competition going on at two levels. There's competition between name and pronoun. And then within the pronoun class, there might be competition between the different, he versus they versus she. So in the case of like the choice between she and he, there's so high frequency that, and also I would say the gender representation of the referent, the pragmatic conditions for choosing she versus he are so well practiced that people just don't make that many mistakes. But in the case of this emerging form, they, it's a little bit more troublesome. And so you might see a little bit more competition between they and he. And so the way, this is really just a very simplistic kind of early proposal for a model for thinking about this. We're just saying, okay, you've got some kind of representation of the reference gender at the conceptual level, which for he and she is going to be determining which pronoun you choose. Now, I just want to point out that these gender representations are actually more complicated than this. It's not like you just have these, simple categorical binary, non-binary versus binary, male or female. But, for starters, we could think about it that way, maybe. At least this could maybe be a stand-in for something like the reference personal pronouns are they, them, which is not quite the same thing as having a non-binary gender. We have, of course, discourse context over here, that my favorite pronoun versus a name. This would account for some of the difficulty effects that we see, because when there is, okay, so let's say a discourse context favors the pronoun. If you have difficulty coming up with they because it's low frequency and maybe you're getting competition from he and maybe representation of non-binary gender is not that solid, you're going to be delayed in activating this form. And this whole class is competing over here with the name class. And that might lead the name to get more activated. And then we'd see more names or descriptions being produced like we did in the writing study. We would also see that if this particular word form is delayed in being activated, that's when you start to see these prosodic effects, like either lengthening a word or saying it with more prosodic prominence. And this is something that I could also direct you to a lot of older work that I've done on this topic with other words, not with non-binary they. Of course, if you have this competition, you might, in fact, just select the wrong word. And that would be a speech error, essentially, where you would get the wrong word getting more activated and being selected by mistake. So at this point, let me look at the clock. We've got, it's 2:40. And so we're going to be trying to finish up in like the next 15 minutes. So Edith, I think I maybe have how much, like 5 or 10 more minutes to talk. What would you say?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think I'm going to just try to say a little bit about this final study, which is one that I did with a group of undergraduate researchers in my lab. And I say 2021 to 22, but it's really ongoing in the sense that we're still writing up the data that we collected. So our question here was, it was actually a broader set of questions. We were just really curious about a lot of stuff related to the use of non-binary they, and also how are people conceptualizing gender and what kinds of changes are happening. the parts of it that I'll talk about today is really how does processing and representing this form relate to individual differences. And so in particular, are some people better at using and understanding non-binary they than others? And I mean, I know that just from watching the world around me, and I can see certain people are a lot better at it than I am. And some people are worse too, I can see, right? And so the three things that I'm going to talk about today, three predictors we looked at were, first of all, gender identity. Does having a gender fluid identity increase facility with using this form? Or if so, is that really just because if you're somebody who is a member of the queer community, you probably know people who use they, them pronouns. So you might use these pronouns used more often. And so is it just exposure, or is there something else about being focused on the importance of using this form? The second one is we measured self-reported exposure. And then the third really big question, and I think the one that's of most interest to me, is how is this usage related to changes in the concepts of gender? And that is essentially asking whether language is a reflection of our conceptual categories. And so to address these questions, we knew that we needed to get a participant sample that was heterogeneous, because one problem with studying individual differences is that if you don't get enough variety within your participants, you just won't get any variation. And so we used a stratified recruitment approach where we recruited participants in two categories. Half of them were what we called the cis-binary group, people who identified as cisgender and use the pronouns he and she as their personal pronouns. And then the other group we called the trans non-binary group, and that was kind of like everybody else. So anybody who either identifies as trans or identifies as non-binary, or both, because people who identify as non-binary sometimes identify as trans and sometimes don't, or genderqueer, or maybe they identify as cisgender, but they use they pronouns, or they have shifted their pronoun use throughout their lifetime. And so our reasoning for recruiting like this is that we predicted that the second group would be more likely to participate in communities where they would get more exposure to non-binary they. So the participants that we ended up with, we had 61 participants total. And it turns out that in the cis-binary group, they were almost all women. And in the trans-binary, non-binary group, we had people with a variety of different gender identities. Couple who identified as men and women, both, and this was what they wrote as their write-in. So if somebody wrote woman, I don't actually know if they identify as trans woman or cisgender woman. But sometimes we could infer that from looking at something else, or man, or cis male, trans male, non-binary, gender non-conforming, trans masculine, non-binary, or other. Okay. So there's some variety there. The pronouns used were, again, mostly she and her for the cis-binary group, and a variety of different things for the trans and non-binary group. So our study had 3 different linguistic tasks, plus an interview where we asked them a variety of questions. The linguistic tasks was first a production task, which was identical to the first experiment in the experiment I just told you about, the Arnold Vig study. Our second task was a comprehension task, which I'm really not going to talk about. It was a mouse tracking task. I presented this one at HSP a few years ago. The first time we did that, it produced some interesting results, but in this particular study, it didn't. So I'm just not going to talk about that one anymore. And then the third one was this acceptability rating task. And then we had a bunch of other interview questions, of which I'm going to use those that resulted in those 3 predictors I mentioned. So the 3 predictors we're going to be looking at are whether gender identity, your own personal gender identity, is binary versus more fluid, whether you think of gender in general out there, not just yourself, but just like what gender is as binary and fixed versus fluid, and how much you are exposed to this form. And we're going to have 2 dependent measures I'm going to talk about today, acceptability ratings, and in the production task, we'll just look at errors. So personal gender identity, we had verbal self-categorization, like I showed you in the previous table, and we had 5 quantitative measures. One of them, we asked people to put themselves on this gender continuum. And then we also had them rate these 4 statements about that kind of probed how they thought about their own gender. All the answers to these were very highly correlated, so we z-scored them and put them into a single predictor that we called personal gender, whether one's own gender identity is fluid versus not. Okay. We then had a series of questions that were aimed at looking at how people think about gender in general. Like, what is gender? Do you think of gender as just like the binary kind of thing that's determined by people's sex, or is it fluid and determined by somebody's personal gender identity? And so following up on this question, which some of you are probably saying, wait a second, that's a problematic question. You know, why do you have this gender continuum that has only binary poles, male and female? Yeah, so it potentially is a problematic one. But the interesting part of this question was that then we followed it up by saying, well, do you think this is a good model of gender? Why or why not? And you know, there's actually a lot of interesting details here that I don't have time to go into, but basically there was a range of responses, but in general, the cis and binary group were more supportive of it than the trans and non-binary group. And the reasons why were super interesting. So basically, anybody who said that, you know, they liked it or had kind of mixed responses, they said, well, one good thing about this model is that it's not just 2 binary categories, that you have some measure of a continuum. Nobody said, oh, this is bad because it's a continuum and you need to have only 2. Nobody ever said that. We had actually a relatively, like, our participant sample was a bit more on the kind of accepting side and slightly more, you know, fluid side of gender representation than you might find out in the rest of the world. But the negatives that people came up with was that it wasn't, this wasn't flexible enough. It didn't allow for some of the other dimensions that might need to be accounted for in gender. In gender identity. We also had 2 statements that people rated their agreement with. People have one gender, it stays the same their entire life, or person's gender is defined by biological sex. And so both of these are reverse coded. And so once you reverse code them, higher on this metric means that you think of gender as more fluid and not fixed. And so these, again, were highly correlated and z-scored and averaged. So our final predictor is self-ratings to your exposure to this form. How many people do you know who use this form? How often do you use it in speech or writing? How often do you hear or read it? The last one we didn't end up using because it didn't correlate with the other 3. And that was, I think, because it was not a good question. Because we asked, just like I asked you, like, how old are you? And we told them to answer, and like the options were middle school, high school, college, or beyond. But since we had people of different ages, it made that question not very informative. So we averaged the first 3 and used that as our metric of exposure. So I'm going to quickly go through the 3 measures. So the first one was acceptability ratings. And so for this, we were using the same kind of methods as Camilleri et al. 2021. But the item I'm going to focus on is one that was a little different from what they did, where we told people, hey, Alex uses they, them pronouns, and then we asked them to rate how natural is it to use they to refer to Alex in a sentence like Alex said they were coming for dinner. And they had a slider bar that went from 0 to 100. And you can see here that these are the ratings that people gave. And generally, people kind of found it pretty acceptable. You know, they kind of liked it, but not 100%. There was some variety there. All right. The other measure is in the production task. Did somebody produce at least one misgendering error? So did anybody ever by mistake say he for Alex? And these 2 dependent measures are correlated so that you can see overall there were 8 people in this binary group who made at least one misgendering error, and there were 7 in the trans non-binary group. And these 2 things were correlated. So here we're looking at the number of people who made an error based on what their ratings are for non-binary they. Are the predictors correlated? Yes, they are. Okay, not surprisingly. So there's a correlation between exposure to they and your gender identity, and between gender concepts and gender identity. So here, remember, what we're talking about as gender identity is scored indicating how fluid or non-binary your gender identity is. So people over on the left are going to be, people who just identify as cisgender, man or woman, and people on the right are going to be more fluid, more non-binary. And there's also correlation between gender concepts and the exposure. So the real question, this is where I'm coming to, do these predictors explain the linguistic measures? And so the first one is, this is a typo. It shouldn't say accessibility. It should say acceptability. I'm so sorry. Acceptability of, to what extent do you find this use of they natural? Okay, so you're giving a rating to the use of they. And in fact, I'm actually just going to change that because I don't want to confuse everybody. This should say acceptability. There we go. All right. So here we see that people who think that gender is more fluid and less binary tend to give higher ratings. Okay. And people who are exposed to the form more tend to give higher ratings. But there is no relationship between one's own personal fluidity of gender identity and the rating. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. What matters is what you think gender is out there in the world across all people, and not what you think your own, and not how you think of your own gender identity. We see the same pattern for errors. So here we're now plotting the average number of people with one or more errors. And so we can see that having greater exposure predicts making fewer errors. Having more fluid gender concepts predicts making fewer errors. But again, no effect of your own personal gender identity. So I would say just very quickly that I think that this leads to a kind of very hopeful view of language, of kind of the trajectory of non-binary they, because language is used conventionally to communicate with other people, and so it kind of makes sense that your own personal gender identity doesn't drive your ideas about the meaning of this word, because that wouldn't be very communicative. That wouldn't be a community-directed use of language. Instead, if you think that this word maps really well onto the way you think that gender works in the world, you're going to find it more applicable, and it's probably more relevant in your life because you probably know more people who use they, them, and you find it easier to use. That said, actually, I kind of skipped over this a little bit, but if we go back here, oh yeah. If you put these two in a model together, only the exposure one was significant. So, I mean, who knows with a larger sample if we could find independent effects of each, but really it looks like potentially this gender concepts thing may be subsumed by exposure. And so it really may just be that people who have those concepts also tend to use it more often. And so, just very briefly, I'd say that the take-home message here is that, non-binary they is an emerging form. And so what we're seeing in production and comprehension is that the ways in which mostly it's actually very similar to he and she. It's being used in the same processing system in the same ways. And the ways that we're seeing that it's different is because it's a low frequency structure. And improved fluency is supported by practice. Practice makes perfect. And of having a conceptual system that is consistent with this linguistic usage. And that is it. And so I'd just like to say thank you to the undergraduates and graduate students who have worked on this, and to my funding. This is partially supported by a couple of recent NSF grants and by an internal Stevenson Linguist grant.